Іларіонова. Він є старшим науковим співробітником Вашингтонського інституту імені Катона і колишнім радником президента Росії в 2000-2005 роках. Говорити будемо про ситуацію економічну в Україні, про ті виклики, які стоять перед нашою країною у 2015 році. Господин Андрій, прошу.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Мы с вами встречались, если я не ошибаюсь, 1,5 месяца тому назад, в конце ноября. И тогда
we met a month and a half ago, and then the main topic of our meeting was the growing threat of default in Ukraine. Unfortunately, in the last 1.5 months, the situation has not improved but worsened, and from the point of view of the main economic indicators and financial indicators, everything goes on according to the forecast. When we met, the international currency reserves of Ukraine were $12.5 billion. By the end of November, they were $10 billion. In December, by the end of December, $7.5 billion. And this way, during the last year, they decreased 3 times. If the decrease of international reserves will continue like that, then we basically have them for 1, 2, or 3 months left only. But at the same time, the commitments of Ukraine compared to the international partners on servicing the credits and on paying the gas are at the same level. They will be probably a little lower in January and February, but starting from March, they will start growing. What should be done in this situation? If this all is happening, then sooner or later, unfortunately sooner, the Ukrainian authorities will have to take a decision to stop servicing their commitments on foreign contracts, and that would mean the technical announcement of default. What should be done to avoid that situation? In Ukrainian society, there are big expectations that the foreign assistance is needed from international financial institutions, and they will save Ukraine submitting different volumes of assistance, and different figures are quoted, $15-17 billion plus to what was approved by the IMF, which will mean in total $30-32 billion. That's the proposal of the government and the president, and up to 50 billion, which is the proposal of Mr. Soros. But we do not see any serious desire from the creditors to provide some serious assistance. The last negotiations between the Ukrainian representatives in Berlin and other places showed that the funds are provided, but in a limited amount and with very strict terms. And Madam Merkel confirmed the readiness of Germany to provide €500 million. Euro Commission made the decision to provide €1.8 billion as assistance to Ukraine. And yesterday, the U.S. stated that they are ready to provide $2 billion, the first billion immediately, and the second one only on condition if reforms are implemented, if there is a progress observed in reforms. This way we see that the funds which Western partners are ready to provide are very limited. Even if they are provided, they give the opportunity to survive 1 or 2 months additionally to what could be survived without that assistance, and it's based on the implementation of absolutely necessary reforms. Whatever is happening, whether there will be the absolutely crisis situation in January, February, maybe in the beginning of March of this year, but principal problem is the same: implementation of reforms, the reforms which can close the sources of losses of currency reserves of Ukraine. And there are three of such main sources. The first one, the biggest one, is, and basically that is where the foreign exchange, foreign reserve is spent. That is payment for gas from Gazprom in November, and in December approximately $1.6–1.7 billion were spent to pay for gas on a monthly basis, and that is approximately two-thirds of all the volume of losses of currency reserves in the last 2 months. This figure can change. It could be smaller, but that's the main source of loss of currency reserves. The loss of currency reserves takes place because the prices for gas in Ukraine are lower, because Ukraine buys approximately 4.5 times more gas per $1 than European countries. And that situation leads to Ukrainian economy being very energy consumption, and the gas is procured, which basically should be saved. The reform of Naftogaz should be conducted with liberalization of gas energy market. We need to increase tariffs so that the revenues and losses and expenditures of Naftogaz are balanced, so that the state budget is not spent and currency reserves are not spent for Naftogaz. The second one is the activities of the National Bank of Ukraine. In the recent months, the National Bank spent $700–800,000 on a monthly basis to maintain the exchange rate of hryvnia, and the fact that there are so many administrative restrictions at the currency market, the fact that there are such restrictions in general, that there are so many courses, exchange courses, shows that the exchange rate of hryvnia is made higher, and it's irrational to maintain it at that level. The NBU is spending reserves and will continue to spend more and more reserves if it continues such a policy. For that, a liberalization of currency market is needed, unification of the exchange courses, and unification of all the banking system. The banks are earning a lot of money on the difference between the official exchange rate, 15–16 hryvnias per dollar, and the actual course at which the population buys currency, and many other businesses which are 19–20 hryvnias per dollar. That is a huge subsidy which goes to intermediaries. And the lack of unification of currency exchange rate is the mandatory condition of approval of any program with the IMF. Liberalization of currency market by NBU will address many of the problems and will allow to resume the program with the IMF, and that also blocks the channel of the loss of currency reserves. And the third source is the total deficit of state budget. Unfortunately, there are no precise figures, despite the fact that the budget was approved on the 29th of December, but I have not seen the figures of the budget in one table. The assessments provided by Viktor Pinzenik, the former Minister of Finance, show that the total state expenditures in 2015 go up from 53% of GDP like it was in 2000 14 to 2/3 of GDP. So basically, the expenditures are not decreased but increased, and that is the way to economic disaster. And the budget deficit, instead of 12% of GDP like it was last year, goes up. What is the amount of the forecast budget deficit? It's difficult to say. According to some assessments, it's about 15%. If we take as the basis the volumes of currency funds which could have been attracted by Ukraine, 32 billion dollars according to the government, up to 50 billion according to George Soros. That means that the total budget deficit could, according to these plans, could be from 25 to 43% of GDP. That is basically the economic suicide. And in order not to allow the loss of currency reserves or economic disaster, in the nearest weeks, all the measures are to be taken to review the budget, which was prepared and approved on the 29th of December, and approve a new budget with a zero budget deficit. Now the main slogan for Ukrainian society, for Ukrainian authorities, is no deficit budget. Ukraine cannot afford to have a deficit budget. The revenues are to be balanced with expenditures, and these figures of expanded budget include the total expenditures of Naftogaz. In the Institute of Economic Analysis, we tried to make a sketch of the budgetary policy, and we offer Ukrainian colleagues to look at that. And this sketch budget or draft budget addresses all the key problems, and also the progress could be achieved in three priority directions for Ukraine. First, that is deficit-free budget, not to spend currency reserves of the country to avoid the default. The second is we need to provide funds for the defense of the country, and the expenditures for defense sector to be increased compared to what these expenditures were last year, and even compared to what is included into this budget. And also the tax burden is to be reduced for Ukrainian business to stop economic fall and to resume economic growth. And if these three requirements are satisfied, then we can get to the situation. Several Ukrainian publications were publishing materials about how to avoid the default, and they suggest to reduce expenditures up to 37% of the GDP. The deficit, instead of 12%, becomes zero deficit, and the expenditures for defense sector go up from 1% last year to minimum 5% of GDP this year.
So this is the structure of the budget, but it does not solve a huge number of problems that there are in the Ukrainian economy, but still allows this year to try to start to solve the most dangerous problems that face the country and create the necessary conditions to restart economic growth. And only in the conditions of economic growth, the Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian society will be able to solve other issues. So this is my main message, and now I'm ready to answer your questions. Have you talked with Ukrainian politicians and government about this? What's their reaction, and do you see their readiness to act? There's a huge problem in the Ukrainian society and partially in Ukrainian political milieu, although over the month and a half that passed since our last meeting, I see the progress, because then the word default was regarded as a bad word, and they were telling me, "You're trying to scare us. What default are you talking about?" Now the people are starting to understand the seriousness of the situation, although of course the first steps should be much bigger, and I'd like to address you and your colleagues so that the issue of economic situation and the danger, the threat of default, if there's nothing done, should be constantly within the sphere of your attention, and something should be done, because the Ukrainian mass media should create the necessary pressure on Ukrainian political milieu and the Ukrainian authorities so that they undertake the necessary steps. The Ukrainian authorities are attentively listening to what is being said in the society and in the media. Without pressure in this direction, they do almost nothing. Otherwise, this is not the issue for Ukrainian authorities. This is the issue for the entire Ukrainian society, and the cause of saving the situation is the cause of the entire Ukrainian society. I have two questions. First is about the lessening of budget expenditure when we switch to pinpointed aid instead of what we have now. I know that the government has not moved forward in this direction. Can you recommend something about this movement? And is it possible to monetize the major part of benefits within a year? This is the first question. And the second is about the tax burden. The Ukrainian business has a great disappointment about the changes that were adopted. How do you think, what is to be done by the government as far as the tactics of the taxation reform is concerned? Both questions are very important and very serious and huge. And the economists are dedicating very long conferences to this. I cannot even name you the main points, but the most affluent groups of population should be deprived of social support. It does not have to be just decreased. It should be removed altogether, like this was done in Georgia. And the social support should be given only to the poorest people. For the rest of the population, the support should be decreased, both monetized and non-monetized. I've been told that there are people in Ukraine who receive pension amounting to 75,000 hryvnia per month. If this is so, then this is simply unbelievable. Such pensions should be decreased, especially if they are paid to people who are associated with the previous regime. As far as taxation is concerned, regrettably, we have to review the entire ideology of the taxation reform, because the so-called taxation reform, which was implemented in the decisions of the Cabinet of Ministers, comes down to providing for the decrease of budget deficit on paper. On paper, it does look as if it were decreased, but we should really decrease the tax burden when applied to small and medium-sized business. The tax burden, which now amounts to 40% of GDP, we cannot expect any economic growth under such conditions. There are no examples like this in the world. The country with a level of economic development like Ukraine cannot grow if the tax burden is about 40%. You should really decrease the tax rates. You should decrease the number of taxes. Of course, we see some improbable innovations like taxation of property, taxation of flats, and they only create social tension and do not solve any financial problems. So I think that ideology should be changed, which leads the cabinet of ministers and other government bodies when they effect the reforms. Thank you very much, Andrey, for... So once again, I would like to address you. My huge request to you is, you know, the contribution of every person now is very important in order to create the feeling of the acuteness of the moment, of the importance of the measures that are being taken, and key directions in which you should act. I repeat, the major slogan of the moment is no deficit budget. But address economists, foreign economists, ask them, launch discussions, address the Ukrainian authorities so that they explain their position, why they are undertaking these or those steps. If I'm not mistaken, the session to review the budget is scheduled for the 15th of February. And we now have a historic opportunity to do this when the Ukrainian society, with their joint efforts, can pressurize the Ukrainian authorities with the help of the parliament to review the budget, to achieve no deficit budget, to achieve the liberalization of the market, and to restructure Naftogaz. Thank you very much. Our next briefing is within 5 minutes.